Most of us have probably heard about places and artifacts that support the Bible and things that happened in it. But have you ever heard about any evidence that supports the Book of Mormon and things that happened in it? Is there any? Well, the answer is yes, there is. But you have to make an effort to go looking for it because it's not widely known. But it's definitely out there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to some real evidence that supports the Book of Mormon. And when I say brief, I'm talking about we're just barely going to scratch the surface here. But first of all, for anybody who doesn't know what the Book of Mormon is all about, it's Christian scripture, like the Bible, about a group of ancient Israelites who came to the land that is now called America around 590 BC. God continued to choose prophets among them and speak to those prophets just as he spoke to the prophets back over in ancient Israel. And there's plenty of evidence of this civilization right here in North America, but most of us don't hear about it because many American scholars cling to this false idea that nobody had the capability of sailing to America before Christopher Columbus. And they dismiss the thousands of artifacts that show ancient Hebrew, Egyptian, Assyrian, cuneiform, and Christianity in ancient North America. And they say that those thousands of artifacts are all somehow fake because it goes against their stubborn claim that Columbus was the first one to come here from across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, enough of that rant. Let's get to it. Here's a list of what I'm briefly going to talk about in this video. For those of you who already know the Book of Mormon, this list will immediately click to you. We're going to talk about an ancient North American civilization that began in the 500s BC and are over by 400 AD. This civilization had many cities and forts surrounded by deep ditches with high walls of dirt. They also had many large mounds of dirt filled with human bones. They had metal armor and weapons, including headplates, breastplates, arm shields, swords, scimitars, axes. They had DNA called haplogroup X, which is traced back to the Mediterranean area, including Israel. And according to some Native Americans' histories, they were lighter-skinned Native Americans who were destroyed in war by darker-skinned Native Americans. And we're also going to talk about ancient Hebrew, Egyptian, Assyrian, and cuneiform writings in North America. We're going to talk about a 600 BC ship sailing the ocean from the Arabian Peninsula to the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to talk about a heavenly God visiting and teaching the ancient Native Americans. We're going to talk about the earthquake of 1811 and 1812 matching the destruction at the time of Jesus Christ's crucifixion. And we're going to talk about Native American words related to Jehovah, the River Sidon, the Narrow Neck, Nephi, and more. Now, I'm willing to guess that most people, including members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormons or LDS, I'm willing to guess that most people don't know about this evidence. I never knew about it until late 2013 when I went looking for it. Probably like many others in the LDS Church, I used to just assume that the Book of Mormon took place in all of the ancient Americas. I thought it was obvious that South America must be the land south, North America must be the land north, and Central America must be the narrow neck of land connecting the two. But almost all of the evidence in the outline I showed you is only in North America, particularly the eastern half of the United States and lower East Canada. So let's get into it. First, the ancient civilization. So here's the United States, and within this circle, this is the main area where an ancient civilization lived who were called the Mound-Builders. Now there's two mound-building civilizations. One is called the Hopewell, and another one is called the Adena. And the Hopewell are who we're going to focus on in this video. They lived from the 500s BC up to 400 AD. Now the Adena, they lived much earlier than the Hopewell. They lived from the 2000s BC right up until about the beginning of the Hopewell. And they lived more near the Great Lakes, but there are traces of the Hopewell and the Adena all throughout the circle and even out west in the western part of the United States area. But before we get talking about them, I just want to explain where the name came from. The name Hopewell has nothing to do with this civilization. The reason why they're called Hopewell is because the very first official archaeologic excavation that was done on the Hopewell Mound-Builders was in 1891 on the property of this guy right here. This guy's name is Mordecai Hopewell, Now, there were many excavations done on the mound builders long before 1891, but the United States, as a brand new country, really didn't have an archaeologic organization until much later. And so that's why in 1891 it was the first official archaeologic dig. And because it was done on Mordecai Hopewell's property, from that point on, any of the mound building civilization that matched what they found on his property was forevermore called Hopewell. Now, the story with the Adena mound builders, the way that they got the name Adena is a very similar story, but like I say, we're not going to talk about them in this video. That'll be for another video. Now, the oldest Hopewell sites are found right down here around the panhandle of Florida. Those date back to the 500s BC. Now, there's also some other areas that date back to the 500s BC, as you can see right up here along the Atlantic coast, then also in Tennessee, and also up here in Iowa. These are all areas where there are Hopewell sites that date back to the 500s BC, again with the very oldest being right there around the panhandle of Florida. And throughout the centuries, they spread all around this eastern half of the United States and lower east Canada. And then the Hopewell civilization gets smaller and smaller until they end right here in New York around 400 AD. Now, here's some cool things to pay attention to. According to the Iroquois Native American history, they say that their ancient ancestors sailed in boats somewhere from the east and arrived somewhere around Florida. And according to the Algonquin Native American history, they say that their ancient ancestors also sailed somewhere from the east, came down through the St. Lawrence Seaway up in Canada, and arrived in the Great Lakes area. And we read in the Book of Mormon that the Lord led Lehi and a small group of people out of Jerusalem in 600 BC, brought them across the ocean, and they landed somewhere in the Americas in a land south, around 589, 88 BC, somewhere around there. And then a couple years later, back over in Jerusalem in 587 BC, when it was captured by the Babylonians, the Lord led Mulek and a group of people out of Jerusalem and across the ocean into a land that was in the north. And we also read in the Book of Mormon that when Mulek and his group got here in the land that was north, they discovered the last living Jaredite. His name was Coriantumr. He was the last of his people alive because there was a major civil war until they had killed each other off. And so Coriantumr was the last one living. And he stayed with Mulek and his people for 9 months, and then he died and was buried by them. And if you remember from the Book of Mormon, the last Jaredite battle took place at the Hill Cumorah in New York, right here, not too far from Lake Ontario. And so if the Mulekites came in from the St. Lawrence Seaway down into Lake Ontario and explored around this Great Lakes area, I'm sure that's how they bumped into Coriantumr and picked him up. Now, when you read in the Book of Mormon, we find out that the people of Mulek settled in one spot, stayed there, and their population grew, and they had a great city called Zarahemla. And their civilization stayed in that area until they were discovered by the Nephites sometime between 279 BC and 130 BC. We don't have an exact date for that in the Book of Mormon. It just gives us a time frame. But here's something interesting. If you go to Doctrine and Covenants, section 125, verse 3, here God commands the prophet Joseph Smith to build a city on the opposite side of Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, Nauvoo, Illinois sits right here on the east side of the Mississippi River. And the Lord tells Joseph to build a city on the west side of the Mississippi River, the opposite side from Nauvoo. And he tells Joseph to name that city Zarahemla. Now, the scripture doesn't say that that's where the city Zarahemla was, but it also doesn't say that that's not where the city Zarahemla was. Now, there's only 3 places in LDS church history that I'm aware of that the Lord specifically names himself. One of those places is New Jerusalem. Another one of those places is Adam-ondi-Ahman. And the other place is Zarahemla. Now, New Jerusalem and Adam-on-Diamond both have great significance, but not much is said about Zarahemla. But I personally don't think that the Lord would just say, hey, Zarahemla is a cool name. Let's call this place Zarahemla. If there's only 3 places in LDS church history that the Lord names himself, and Zarahemla is one of those places, I think we ought to pay attention to that. And by the way, what state is Zarahemla in? It's in Iowa. And remember, Iowa is one of the places where we find Hopewell sites dating back to the 500s BC. And the Mulekites arrived in America sometime in the 500s BC after Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BC. But if you pay attention as you're reading in the Book of Mormon, even though the Mulekites arrived in the land northward, they didn't settle there. They settled in the land that would become the land of Zarahemla. And they stayed there and eventually built the great city Zarahemla. And they were there when the Nephites moved further north and discovered them. And again, as you pay attention to your reading in the Book of Mormon, the city Zarahemla and the land of Zarahemla were also a part of the land southward. So the Mulekites arrived in the land northward, but they didn't stay there. They kept moving and settled in Zarahemla, which is in the land southward. So if the Mulekites came in through the St. Lawrence Seaway, north of the Great Lakes, and that area being the land northward, they come down to the St. Lawrence Seaway into Lake Ontario, explore around that area, they find Coriantumr, the last jaredite, but they don't stay there, they keep moving on, and then eventually settle in Iowa, which is also the state where the Lord told Joseph to build a city and call it Zarahemla, right across the river from Nauvoo, Illinois. It's something pretty cool to think about. Now let's talk about the Hopewell sites found in Tennessee that date back to the 500s BC. If you remember from the Book of Mormon, still sometime in the 500s BC when Nephi was still alive, he talks about how his older brothers, Laman and Lemuel, were becoming more and more hostile to him and the people who sided with him. Laman and Lemuel thought, because they were the older brothers, that they should be the rulers after Lehi, their father, passed away. But Nephi was the ruler of the people, and Laman and Lemuel didn't like that one bit. And the Lord warns Nephi that Laman and Lemuel are going to try and kill him, and that he needs to take all the people who will follow him and leave that land. And so Nephi does as the Lord commands, and he leaves that area and goes northward to what they later call the land of Nephi. And that's where they settle. And this is still sometime in the 500s BC. And that's where you get the division of Lehi's children, one division being called the Lamanites, after the older brother Laman, and the other group being called Nephites, after the younger brother Nephi. So anyways, throughout the Book of Mormon, the Nephites and the Lamanites continue to grow. The Nephites eventually meet up with the Mulekites, like I mentioned earlier. The Nephites leave the land of Nephi and go north and discover the Mulekites living in Zarahemla. And the Mulekites join with the Nephites, and so they're all called Nephites. And throughout the centuries in the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites and the Nephites continue to grow. They fight and have wars with each other. And eventually the Lamanites start to overpower the Nephites in war, and the Nephites are chased north and east by the Lamanites up into New York, where the hill Cumorah is, the same place where the Jaredites were destroyed 1,000 years earlier. And by 400 AD, the Nephites have been completely destroyed by the Lamanites. And what few survivors there were of the Nephites, the Book of Mormon tells us that they joined in with the Lamanites rather than die. So there's some brief parallels about how the Nephites and Lamanites fit nicely with the Hopewell people.